Hello, and thank you for attending. My name is Elizabeth Vander Meer, and I work for the University of Edinburgh in climate and biodiversity research and policy, but I also undertake academic research through the University of Exeter, and I'm currently doing a PhD in anthrozoology there, but of course I'm based in Edinburgh. I'm really glad to have this opportunity to share my research on long-tailed macaques in Mauritius, and I wanted to thank OneKind for this opportunity. I'm really keen to undertake further research, however, because questions I posed during my pilot study are still to some degree unanswered and other questions arose. I thought I'd start with a quote from Radhakrishna in the book The Macaque Connection, which explains the complexity of human-macaque interactions and the ways in which humans perceive these monkeys in many countries. In their interactions with humans, macaques often play multiple roles that transcend boundaries or categorization. They are simultaneously pets and symbols of wild nature, deities, crop raiders, marauders and protected wards, employees and companions, surrogate humans and dispensable animals. And I'm just going to turn off my video right now so it doesn't get in the way of the slides, and move on to the next. My research in Mauritius was conducted on and off between 2016 and 2018 through both remote engagement with participants and fieldwork, with updates to some data gathered in 2019 recently. I began to understand how the monkeys' introduced pest status allows for their use as biomedical objects and for partnerships between conservation organizations and the biomedical breeding companies on the island. At the same time, the legitimacy of their conservation and cultural pest status is called into question due to issues around evidence. The main goal of my research was to begin to understand differing perceptions of macaques in Mauritius, but to go farther than that. So it's important to understand perceptions of pest behavior and the extent of mismatch between perception and reality. So my aim was to also uncover any mismatch in this context. I position myself within compassionate conservation and ethnoprimatology and approach the subject in terms of human-wildlife coexistence, including non-lethal methods of population control and communities of entangled, interconnected organisms. So on the slide you see a definition of compassionate conservation, which is really bringing animal welfare into conservation biology. And ethnoprimatology is trying to discard this duality between human and nature, and also understand multi-species entanglements and explore them. So I'll first explain how my project began and provide an overview of competing perceptions of these monkeys as introduced pest, biomedical object, and sacred animal. I'll then present the history of the macaques, go into further detail on perceptions of macaque populations based on my research, concluding with recommendations and potential challenges to pest perceptions that could diminish instances of lethal conflict. And these are based on suggestions from locally based study participants. All participants in my pilot study have been anonymized to protect their identities. So any quotes that you see have against them names that have been anonymized. I became interested in macaques in Mauritius after reading chapters by Robert Sussman and by Nada Padici in the book Monkeys on the Edge, which looked at the ecology and management of long-tailed macaques worldwide, but mainly from an ethnoprimatology angle. Sussman's on the left in the slide and Padiachi's on the right. Sussman noted a decline in macaque populations and argued that there was room for coexistence, while Padiachi identified no population decline and emphasized the pest status of the macaques. Sussman was an anthropologist, while Padiachi works within the biomedical breeding industry on the island. Beyond this, little research has been undertaken to date to explore perceptions of macaques in Mauritius, possibly due to the monkeys' lack of conservation standing. And importantly, no research has been undertaken to explore this possible mismatch between perception and reality. I contacted Professor Sussman, I think, in early 2016, and he was extremely supportive of my research and provided me with contacts. But sadly, he died in the summer of 2016, which was a great loss to anthropology, and also for the monkeys because he was quite an advocate. And generally, he was just an overall good person. The case of macaque populations in Mauritius adds complexity to discussions of human-wildlife coexistence at a time of anthropogenic biodiversity loss, now called the sixth mass extinction. Studies of long-tail macaques in countries where they're indigenous, for instance in Bali and Thailand, describe perceptions of these monkeys as often contradictory. They're at once considered sacred based on cultural symbolism, but also viewed as pests materially due to crop raiding behaviors, and this latter perception could counter conservation efforts for these indigenous populations. So that relates back to the quote from Radhakrishna. But I put this on the slide because it shows you the status of introduced macaques in the Global Invasive Species Database. So they are considered one of the 100 worst invasive species. Macaques in Mauritius then lose conservation value and protection as introduced species deemed pests and invasives. They are seen to threaten certain indigenous endangered species, and they gain value as objects for the biomedical industry, bred on the island and exported by 5 companies that have been established there since the 1980s. While these may appear to be the prevailing perceptions of macaques, a segment of the Indian Hindu population in Mauritius views the monkeys as sacred, and this sacredness attaches to place at the Ganga Talao temple site. I'll just give you a little bit of a historical background, so you're more well placed when you hear more about the macaques. So Mauritius is known as the former and only native home of the dodo, which you're probably aware of, an almost mythical bird that has come to typify the extinction of other species by anthropogenic means, mainly hunting in this case, and the fragility of island populations and ecosystems. Conservationists on the island consider themselves to be working on the extreme end of a crisis discipline, fighting hard to prevent another endemic species extinction. Long-tailed macaques arrived in Mauritius with the first European settlers in the 17th century. The founder population of monkeys derived from escaped or released animals that had probably been pets. Researchers have speculated that the current macaque population originated from Sumatran or Javan populations. Macaques thrived, and a small founder population expanded to 35 to 40,000 by the mid-1990s. As part of a small island developing state, the main island of Mauritius suffers from isolation, a large human population of more than 1 million, contained within just under 2,000 kilometers squared, and a lack of natural resources. The arrival of European settlers marked the beginning of massive anthropogenic change. The island had no indigenous humans prior to this. The most significant deforestation resulted from the development of the sugarcane industry under French and then British colonial rule. This industry also involved African slave labor and indentured servitude of immigrants from India. Only approximately 2% of original forests remain. Sugarcane fields still cover half of Mauritius, but high-end tourism has begun to predominate the economy, colonizing the coastline. The human population in Mauritius consists of an Indian Hindu majority, African Creoles, who are primarily Roman Catholic, Muslims, Chinese and French Catholic, and other Europeans, who make up 2% of the island population. Indian Hindus have dominated politically through family dynasties ever since the island gained independence in 1968. The creation of the Ramayana Center, supported by Parliament, and the importance of Ganga Talao Temple at Grand Bassin as a sacred site for pilgrimage begin to explain the place of Hinduism in Mauritius. The monkey god Hanuman figures in Hindu mythology as a hero and protector in the Ramayana epic. Research in the Indian state of Himachal Pradesh found that 90% of those surveyed believed rhesus macaques to be incarnations of Hanuman, while 20% believed the same of Hanuman langurs. However, these perceptions did not necessarily prevent human aggression towards crop raiding macaques. Shrines to Hanuman grace many residences in Mauritius, and a large shrine to the monkey god can be found at Ganga Talao, as pictured here. So how are macaques located within this context of diminished original forest area and land turned over to agriculture and tourism? A study conducted in the early 1980s tracked monkeys and found they ranged by grounded subgroups as far as 1,150 meters daily across a private reserve surrounded by sugarcane fields and characterized by a diverse landscape of savanna with few trees and evergreen forests. They always return to congregate as a large group in the same thicket hillside site by dusk. Research suggests that the apparent success of long-tailed macaques in Mauritius relates to high levels of habitat disturbance, which has created exploitable niches for the monkeys that include agricultural land with readily available food sources. They're called edge species because they can thrive on the disturbed edges of human settlements. So along with populations in the west of Mauritius, monkeys range in the northwest near Port Louis, which you can see on the map quite clearly, and in the southwest by the Black River region, which is the green area down below, and that includes Grand Bassin and the Ganga Talao temple site. For the most part, the monkeys live in remote habitats and do not interact with the local people, according to Sussman and colleagues. So the conservation view of long-tailed macaques prevails in Mauritius and is tied to biomedical breeding, while also aligning with the agricultural view of these animals as pests. So I'll introduce these perceptions first. And I'll start with a brief intro to endangered birds, because these are a focus of conservation efforts. So endemic endangered birds feature prevalently in current conservation initiatives for Mauritius. For instance, the pink pigeon has garnered significant conservation interest as a bird species that has wavered on the edge of extinction. Mauritius signed the Convention on Biological Diversity before any other country, perhaps because of its dodo legacy and the subsequent number of extinctions that had occurred. The island has in place a biodiversity action plan that has named invasive alien species as the most serious current threat to the remaining terrestrial biodiversity. The Voluntary National Review report published in 2019, which tracks progress against Sustainable Development Goals, describes development activities and invasive species as key reasons for loss and degradation in the section addressing SDG 15. Among alien invasives, long-tailed macaques have been singled out as a key culprit in the decline of birds such as the pink pigeon due to their predation on eggs and chicks, as well as in the decline of native indigenous flora through their seed dispersal of non-native plant species. The SDG report 2019 notes and rightly applauds the recovery of the kestrel, pink pigeon, and echo parakeet, describing success due to habitat restoration and invasive species control. But I should say that this report does not specifically mention long-tailed macaques as invasives having this impact on birds. I've discovered that elsewhere in scientific articles. I've found kind of differing opinions on this in scientific articles, actually. So in forest fragments and forest edges, long-tailed macaques live within the National Protocol for Addressing Nuisance Animals, developed by one of the conservation organizations on the island. Wild monkeys are addressed in the protocol in ways that involve killing individuals. And you'll see on the slide the different categories that the monkeys might fall into and the different actions that will be taken when they do. And you'll also see that these basically involve lethal control. Such culling protocols are common in conservation and in wildlife services married to agricultural interests. For instance, apparent in previous research I've undertaken in actions of the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission and Scottish Natural Heritage in Scotland. Conservationists also back the actions of the biomedical breeding companies in Mauritius and collaborate on conservation initiatives. Breeding company representatives argue that trapping for their facilities has provided some population control of free-ranging macaques while also paying for conservation through a conservation levy to government for each monkey exported. One breeding company has used revenues to seed fund conservation projects in Mauritius and neighboring Rodriguez. Breeding companies also convert monkeys into financial and social commodities in biomedical research facilities. And this approach has been deemed a win-win for Mauritian indigenous wildlife and for human societies, but not so if we consider individual macaques. In 2019, approximately 7,744 macaques were exported live to North America and Europe, with the US, Spain, and the UK taking the most individuals for animal testing. Mauritius ranks second after China in number of monkeys shipped live to Europe and North America for experimentation. And they're popular because as an isolated population since the 1600s, Mauritian macaques are free from simian viruses that can transfer to humans, and their genetics have meant that they are useful in HIV research. In 2017, the Mauritian government agreed to allow experimentation on the island after lobbying from breeding companies and support from the Ministry of Agro-Industry and Food Security. But I've not been able to obtain an update on whether this is now in progress. What perceptions of macaques shape this world where culling and experimentation are acceptable and warranted? Well, conservation texts define macaques out of place as alien invasives, as we've seen, one of the world's worst invaders. The focus on protecting indigenous species against these introduced species that thrive out of place, and the pejorative language surrounding these transgressive animals, often transforms them into disliked and dispensable groups. The impetus in conservation has been described as one of maintaining boundaries and restoring natural order, with the alien invasive not natural in this sense. But inconsistency abounds in conservation, as pointed out by Milton, who describes how some species are tolerated when out of place, for instance pheasants in Britain, if they have some economic or aesthetic benefit, or if eradication is too costly. Of course, introduced species can impact indigenous species significantly, and examples abound, such as the high-profile cane toad in Australia and the coqui frog in Hawaii. But this is not always the case for macaques. West Papua and Kabaena Islands exhibit low levels of environmental degradation, and populations of introduced macaques in these locations have remained low. Macaques have been successful at surviving, and they thrive in places on the edge, as mentioned, where other species may decline and perish. They adapt quickly to anthropogenically induced environmental change, which has been plentiful in Mauritius. So conservationists I interviewed, regardless of ethnic or religious background, foregrounded the macaques' introduced status so that these primates had no place ecologically in Mauritius. Conservationist and researcher Paul described the decline of the endangered dodo tree as one example of the impact of macaques, and he spoke to me at length about the issue here, where the macaques eat the unripe fruit when the seeds are not yet mature, so this does not result in seed dispersal. In fact, it stops the chain of seed dispersal. Conservationist Michel noted predation of monkeys on pink pigeon eggs. However, this evidence in this case is mostly anecdotal. But population is a crucial and contentious issue, even amongst conservation-aligned participants I interviewed for this project. Michel explained macaques is fairly ubiquitous, and he started out saying they're found everywhere, and he did kind of focus on Grand Bassin and Black River Gorge and the edges of forests, but he did seem to think that they would be experienced by Mauritians quite regularly. So breeding company participants provided one estimate of the total population, and that was between 40 to 60,000. And this figure aligns with the population estimate obtained through survey in the 1980s. Breeding companies have stressed that the population has remained stable despite trapping, so they think this is a reasonable estimate, even though they have not undertaken a recent survey. At the height of activity, breeding companies trapped 2,000 to 3,000 monkeys yearly. Trapping began in the 1980s, but most breeders officially stopped the practice of trapping in 2009, and European legislation puts pressure on breeders to only use captive-born animals for breeding and export. But other conservationists provided responses that could challenge breeders' population estimates. Macaque populations may have collapsed in 2008 to 9, and Paul cited strong anecdotal evidence of this significant decline, as you'll see on the slide. A survey conducted by Guidi and Sussman showed a decline in population to an estimated 8,000 monkeys around this time. That was around this time. Researchers held that some exporters still exported wild-caught macaques rather than the first-generation captive-born monkeys. Breeding company participants refute the 2009 population estimate, though, explaining or believing that the study was conducted at an inappropriate time of year. The majority of conservationists and breeders in this study, again regardless of religious or ethnic background, agreed that lethal control of monkeys was justified to protect indigenous species. They also noted that education was key, as many Mauritians were unaware that monkeys had been introduced. But the government has not instigated a systematic and open culling program, as in the case of indigenous bat population control. The bat cull, initiated on the behest of agricultural interests at the end of 2015, met with significant protests from conservationists and other groups. And this was not only because they were afraid of the endangerment of these bats in terms of IUCN status, but also because of animal welfare issues, the way in which the cull was being undertaken. So the 2019 Voluntary National Review Report refers to the bat problem that has arisen due to bats being perceived by commercial fruit farmers as pests, and the same report refers to macaques as biomedical objects kept in captive conditions that meet international welfare standards. However, macaques, as I've mentioned, are invisible in recent government biodiversity reports outlining progress against biodiversity goals in terms of how to manage so-called alien invasives. Conservationist David explained, "Monkeys are not pests like the bats are considered now. There are people of many different religions in Mauritius. For Hindus, the monkeys are sacred. This cannot end like the bats with a cull, since 70% of the island population identifies as Hindu." Alan, employed by a biomedical breeding company, did explain exceptions to trapping at Ganga Talau related to perceptions of the monkeys as sacred. And I have a full quote from him there. So he talks about Hanuman, but he also talks about the risk of zoonotic disease transmission, which is another reason why they wouldn't trap in that area. But Alan and Chris, also working in biomedical breeding, identified inconsistency in belief, as Indian Hindu farmers would often call to have so-called nuisance monkeys trapped or killed. In the context of Balinese Hinduism, sacredness transfers to monkeys in sacred places, while in other places the monkeys fail to have protected status, which appears to be the case in Mauritius. So now we can explore macaques as sacred animals. So Ganga Talau temple site has provided macaques with a place for mutualism, where tourists and visitors on pilgrimage, as well as local people, expect to see the monkeys and consider them part of the temple experience. As part of place, monkeys obtain food left specifically for them, or they're allowed to take from food offerings left throughout the temple site. They choose to travel to the site and to engage with humans. Most interviewees in my study, representing sociocultural animal welfare and protection groups in Mauritius, describe the monkeys in terms of their cultural status within a majority Indian Hindu population. The primates have value as sacred reflections of monkey god Hanuman and as sentient, intelligent, social individuals similar to humans. So they're not only sacred, but they're seen as individuals. Arjun, a member of Hindu Culture NGO, described the presence of monkeys at Ganga Talau, explaining that visitors, whether locals, pilgrims, or tourists, enjoyed the macaques and found them interesting. He stated, "The monkeys are not seen as pests at Grand Bassin and can be found on site every day. They are friendly and entertaining, and fruits are given to them. Tourists enjoy them. Sometimes members of the public will provoke the monkeys by taunting them, and they will become aggressive. There are incidents like this at Grand Bassin, but it's the fault of the people." So now I'm going to try to minimize this. And take you to a web page for Ganga Talau community group. And I can show you very quickly a video of a visiting macaque. And you can see below there a comment that says living honeymoon. So a lot of interaction takes place at Ganga Talao temple site, and while there may be instances of aggression between humans and macaques, these animals are welcome there. So this gives you a flavor of what it's like eating a banana. Okay. A couple of bananas. Alright. Arjun also explained his personal view of macaques, and he stated, it seems consistent to protect these animals. With animals at home, dogs and cats, why would we take a different attitude towards the monkeys? The monkey is sacred in the Hindu religion. Monkeys and cows are prayed to. Self-described traditional Hindu and animal advocate Pranab voiced frustration about inconsistency between belief and behavior amongst Hindus, and he said, every Hindu on the island should show concern for the treatment of macaques, and they should act on that concern by actively supporting animal welfare and protection campaigns. Cruelty Free International, a UK-based animal protection NGO, developed a presence through the Save Our Monkeys campaign, attempting to connect with the Hindu majority and the international Hindu community through a targeted video campaign. In 2012, the NGO, then BUAV, issued a statement of concern regarding the monkeys to the Mauritian government, and this was supported by 22 local religious and sociocultural groups, many of which I spoke to when I was there. Arjun explained why his organization had not become more involved in CFI campaigns. He said, we were only approached by one representative from CFI. We might become more involved in support for the macaques if that animal protection organization established a permanent branch on the island and followed up regularly, or if more organizations were involved. Anne, member of Animal Welfare on the island, noted that individuals within their organization supported the CFI campaigns and considered some conservation groups' methods of lethal control for introduced invasive species to be deeply problematic. And her quote is here, she was particularly concerned about feral cats and the way in which they were controlled through culling that involved inhumane practices, hitting them against trees to kill them, for instance. At the same time, Anne could understand arguments for animal experimentation, so she wasn't necessarily against biomedical breeders being on the island. So in contrast to conservation and breeder descriptions, Pranab noted that in 2016, monkeys had become almost invisible on the island, seen ever more rarely in places where they had been encountered regularly. This decline elicited concern regarding whether trapping had ceased or whether the government was allowing significant culling of troublesome individuals. News articles in 2016 highlighted the increasing rarity of monkeys frequenting Ganga Talao. One article suggested that the monkeys were able to survive on forest fruits in the absence of cyclones that would have destroyed these food sources, so they weren't needing to go into human settlements or into agricultural land. A breeding company explained the absence of macaques as a result of noisy construction work in the area. Workmen on site may have been actively scaring the monkeys away because of food stealing and belonging stealing behavior. And that image that you see on the screen I took at Black River Gorge, and we're able to spot with binoculars 2 or 3 monkeys in the distance above that cliff face that you see scampering through the trees. But during my time in Mauritius, driving in the interior of the country in monkey terrain rather than along the coast and in urban areas, and during an excursion to make observations at Ganga Talao and here at Black River Gorge, I saw no monkeys in close proximity, but I know it's difficult to generalize based on my observations made over such a short timescale of several weeks. Pranam noted an increase in monkeys visiting the temple site from 2018, however. So in my research, I was concerned about routes to coexistence. And I think I did identify a mismatch between, or what appeared to be a mismatch between pest perceptions and reality playing out in Mauritius. The markedly different conceptions of population presented to me by study participants and found in available literature reveal a lack of clarity around this issue, and again around monkeys as ubiquitous pests. Responses also provoke concern as to whether different interests promote a different population figure to advance or support their position without adequate evidence. However, any argument for coexistence must acknowledge the conservation view that monkeys may negatively impact flora and fauna. Paul stated that to coexist with monkeys, you would have to give away much of the native biodiversity on the island, and he provided significant anecdotal accounts of the effects of macaques on native flora, gathered over many years. This is a real crisis in his eyes and in the eyes of other conservationists I interviewed. Despite the elusiveness of macaques to systematic study, research of free-roaming populations is vital to understanding the real impact of macaques on endangered endemics and in comparison to other pressures. Sussman and colleagues were cautious about the degree to which monkeys should be implicated as a major cause of the decline of the pink pigeon, as one example. A survey conducted by an independent researcher could result in conclusions that would lay bare the reality of macaque behavior and impact, gaining approval from both conservationists, breeders, and animal welfare and protection groups. It could capture whether these highly adaptable monkeys are changing their behaviors under new environmental conditions, and so were seen less frequently at Ganga Talao and elsewhere, or whether their diminished presence has reflected population decline. Research that follows monkey troops or captures their behavior over time at the temple site would also hone in on individuals. This knowing of individuals could be shared with island inhabitants holding pest perceptions to shift views from generic monkey to knowable, unique, and vulnerable, relatable individual. Researcher Knight described an empathy that developed between Japanese villagers and individual nuisance monkeys they killed, and quoted one villager. As they were dying, they put their hands to their eyes as though they were crying. I just can't shoot them anymore. Population surveys could begin to answer questions regarding impact, size of populations in different regions, macaque behavior changes, and perceptions of nuisance related to population, but they would not necessarily speak to how or whether populations should be controlled, or why macaques matter out of place. The monkey protocol sanctions lethal control of wild monkeys damaging crops and threatening wildlife or public safety. It is not clear how many monkeys are killed yearly as a result of nuisance complaints, or whether methods of shooting could be considered humane. Veterinary services provide annual numbers of trapped monkeys, but these appear surprisingly small and do not note what happens to these individuals. It would be beneficial for government to ensure that culling statistics are publicly available, with clear indications regarding why an animal was killed and how the animal died. If any macaques labeled nuisance are trapped rather than killed and then enter breeding facilities, transparency around this practice would be valuable to promote dialogue and openness across conservation, breeding, and welfare protection groups. Conservationists may not consider numbers killed if high to be concerning, but welfare should be a salient issue, as it was in the case of the indigenous bat cull, which I've already introduced. The compassionate approach to conservation developing from within the field can inform any methods of control and align with what appears to be an underlying cultural prohibition on an outright cull of macaques due to acknowledgement of Hindu beliefs. Knight described the setting aside of fruiting trees for monkeys in his exploration of perceptions of Japanese macaques, for instance. Similar approaches, including monkey proofing, deterrence, or even contraception, could be considered, drawing on expertise from the Wild Conservation Research Unit at Oxford, which already has a research presence in Mauritius. It is important to acknowledge that both humans and macaques have inhabited Mauritius for approximately the same amount of time, and humans have devastated and continue to devastate island flora and fauna. At the same time, it's important to acknowledge the context of an island developing state and the socioeconomic struggles within that context. Conservationists, among others, often locate humans outside of conservation narratives that label other species alien invasives. Equally, the new proposition of experimentation taking place in Mauritius must be considered in terms of welfare and whether instances of ethics dumping could occur. Several study participants noted a social or political dormancy or passivity amongst Mauritians, a lack of engagement so that action on issues is slow to occur. Researchers have described an absence of strong civil society movements in Mauritius and a culture of fear of reprisals or blacklisting, in which individuals are reluctant to speak out or act against state policies. Research by Vincent Florens at University of Mauritius describes how conservation efforts have been stymied by the interference of politicians for their own interests. Conservationist David explained problems with government engagement. The government on other issues, bats for example, has failed to engage with NGOs to have a discussion. Political appointments are made, but these are not experts. They are supposed to be advised by experts. Suggestions coming out of discussions with study participants who worked for NGOs included encouraging greater synergy amongst organizations on the island to mobilize more individuals around these issues, and specific focus on engaging with youth groups. Young people represented real hope for the future of Mauritius. But I was also reading a recent article about the fact that Mauritius has an aging population similar to the UK or to Scotland, and that's really important to engage with older groups on these issues as well, of course. Additional research of the macaque-human interface in Mauritius has potential to find avenues for coexistence, so that these monkeys are part of place more widely through an expanded mutualism. Subsequent studies of perceptions can further investigate practices of breeding and experimentation, because I just touched the surface really, explore farmers' views, the views of youth groups, and individuals who eat monkeys or keep monkeys as pets. And this is an area that I didn't get into much at all. I wanted to close by introducing Action for Primates, a new organization focusing on international trade in primates, including in Mauritius. And I hope to do further work with them in the future. I had a discussion recently with one of the founders about COVID-19 and impacts on primates. There's been clear conservation concern for great apes in particular, both free roaming in their indigenous context and for those in captivity, as they are at risk of becoming infected by humans. The issue of bushmeat or wet markets and international trade in wildlife has also been highlighted by the outbreak. At the same time, demand for long-tailed macaques as experimental objects may increase in the search for a cure. So I thought that ethnoprimatologist Augustin Fuentes and anthropologist Robert Sussman provide valuable perspectives to consider for human-wildlife coexistence, and when we look at the way that long-tailed macaques are lived towards as conservation's pests and the biomedical industry's experimental objects. Fuentes states, "We need to reject domesticated versus wild, natural versus unnatural, and engagement versus detachment dichotomies in the study of human-alloprimate interfaces." And Sussman and colleagues, after their research in Mauritius, state, "This is a valuable, interesting, and extremely social and intelligent animal from which we can learn a great deal. This knowledge should not be restricted to our interest in our own health. We realize that a solution to saving some natural populations on the island will not be simple or easy, but we hope that a solution to this problem will be attempted and achieved. And so do I." So I just wanted to thank you for listening, and I look forward to taking any questions you might have at a later time. Okay, thank you very much, and hope you enjoyed the festival. Thank you.